Action of a machine to fire 450 rounds a minute is necessarily complex. Starting with loading, you will be taken through all the stages of action in the Browning gun that produce this rapid rate of fire. This retaining ball allows the round to be fed in and prevents it from slipping back. The round is fed in by the feed slide with its feed pawl. Their movement is controlled by the feed arm, which operates within the feedway in the top of the breech block. When the cocking handle is pulled to the rear for the first time, the breech block is also pulled to the rear. This causes the feed arm to pivot and push the feed slide out over the first round. Watch the movement again. This action allows the feed pawl to move over the round held by the retaining pawl and grip it. Watch it again from immediately in front of the breech block. All this happens when the cocking handle is pulled back. Now, when the cocking handle is released, the breech block moves forward and the round is carried across. If we look at it again, we shall see the feed pawl pushing the first round hard up against the cartridge and bullet stops. This round has dragged all the other rounds after it, so that the second round is now held by the retaining pawl. The first round is now ready to be put into the chamber. The mechanism for doing so is a transporter, an attachment on the breech block. On the inside of the cover of the gun is a spring. With the cover closed, this spring is in contact with the transporter, forcing it downwards, making the transporter grip the first round. When the cocking handle is pulled for the second time, the breech block moves to the rear and, as we see from this side view, withdraws the first round. Now we'll watch the action again from the top and see the round leave the belt. On the transporter, a plunger moves along the top of the transporter cams and is kept in contact by the cover spring. In the path of the plunger is a ramp, which will force the plunger inwards. Let's see this happen from above. The transporter is now free to be pressed down by its guide ramp. Thus, the round is forced down and its rim is caused to enter the extractor grooves of the breech block. The round itself is not yet in line with the firing pin hole. The round is now clear of the feedway and could slide down the extractor grooves and drop off were it not for this transporter claw, which continues to hold the round on the face of the breech block. This completes one of the actions which occur on backward movement. Now let us put the breech block forward again to see another action on backward movement which happens at the same time. On top of the gun is the cover catch. Below this is the top plate in which there is a recess. Held within this recess is the tip of the cocking lever. Now, when the breech block moves to the rear, the cocking lever is forced over. its lower end set in the slot of the firing pin has drawn the firing pin to the rear of the breech block, thus compressing the firing pin spring against the sear spring pin. The sear spring exerts an upward pressure. The rear end of the spring holds the sear in its upper position. The lower end of the sear has a recess called a bent. This bent hooks round the firing pin bent to hold the firing pin at the rear of the breech block. So much for the mechanism of the breech block itself on backward movement. Now the breech block must have a platform on which to move. This is partly provided by the barrel extension, which is screwed to the barrel. In its forward position, the breech block rests in the barrel extension to which it is locked by the breech lock. Here it is. The breech lock fits into a recess in the breech block and is kept there by a cam in the floor of the gun body. While the lock stands on the cam, the barrel and barrel extension must move as one piece. Now behind the barrel extension is the lock frame. This is fixed to the gun body and cannot move. It acts as a platform to the breech block in its backward position. A projection on each side at the front of the lock frame is in line with a corresponding slot on each side of the barrel extension. The projections fit into the slots during backward movement. When the breech block moves to the rear, it takes the barrel extension with it until the lock is clear of the cam, when the lock will be forced down by its trunnions striking the projections. This disengages the barrel extension from the breech block. Now watch it again, and this time you can see that the breech block moves independently to the rear. While this was going on, something else happened in the lock frame. Let us go back. Pivoted within the lock frame is the accelerator. The lock frame also contains the barrel return spring. If we remove the breech block, we see the T-piece of the barrel extension and jutting from its side, a stud. The end of the barrel return spring rod rests on this stud. Backward movement of the barrel extension rotates the accelerator and compresses the barrel return spring. The backward movement of the breech block itself continues this rotation until the accelerator is stopped by this stud on the other side of the lock frame. Immediately, this spring asserts itself and locks these two faces together, thus locking barrel extension and lock frame together. So much for the locking of lock frame and barrel extension. Let us take the breech block partly forward again to watch something else which happens at the same time. The backward movement of the breech block compresses a return spring. Here it is, and the block comes to a halt against this buffer in the rear plate. This completes our examination of the actions which take place during the backward movement of the breech block. At the end of the backward movement, the various components are in the following state. There is a round on the face of the breech block, ready to be fed into the chamber. Note that it is not opposite the firing pin hole in this position. A round is held between the feed pawl and the retaining pawl. Here is the feed pawl, here the retaining pawl. The round is ready to be fed into line with the transporter. The breech block is cocked. The tip of the cocking lever is forward, therefore its lower end has drawn the firing pin to the rear, where it is held by the sear. the barrel extension and the lock frame are locked together. You remember how this was done by the T-piece and the accelerator cams. And a very powerful return spring is fully compressed. All these things have been brought about by pulling the cocking handle twice. The first time, the feed slide moves out over the first round in the belt, which is held by the retaining pawl. And when the cocking handle is released, the feed slide moves this round into position for transporting to the chamber. The second time the cocking handle was pulled, this round was gripped by the transporter and drawn to the rear by the breech block. When the cocking handle is released for the second time, the return spring asserts itself to drive the breech block violently forward. Now let us watch the forward movement of the breech block. This involves several things that happen at the same time. We'll examine each one separately. First, at the end of backward movement, there was a round on the face of the breech block above the firing pin hole. Forward movement will cause the transporter plunger to be forced down by the underside of the cam, which is fixed to the gun body, thereby lining up the round between the firing pin hole and the chamber. The unlocking of the barrel extension and lock frame is precisely the reverse action to the one that locked them. Further forward movement of the breech block from this position unlocks them. Let us go back to the locked position and examine the unlocking process in detail. It is because the rear of the breech block, on moving forward, flicks the accelerators forward, thus forcing their cams from the T-piece so that the barrel return spring can force the barrel extension forward. Let us stop a moment and see the effect of this movement of the barrel extension on the breech lock. The breech lock, on striking the breech lock cam, is lifted into the recess of the breech block, so locking barrel extension and breech block together. Let us look at the gun from above and watch the effect of this forward movement on the feed mechanism. We see the feed slide move across. It carries with it the round which was gripped by the feed pawl on backward movement. If we remove the feed slide, we see that this round is lined up against the cartridge and bullet stops, ready for the transporter. The transporter is guided to follow the cams by its stud and rises to grip the next round while the breech block puts the first round in the chamber. To digress for a moment, should the transporter fail to withdraw this round when it is against this stop, there is a feed pawl extension which prevents the feed pawl operating, since the extension rides over the round which was not withdrawn. You will remember that when the round is withdrawn, the feed pawl extension is free to drop in the gap and is no hindrance to the operation of the feed pawl. But to continue, let us imagine that the transporter has gripped the round and a round is now in the chamber. At this stage, we have the breech block fully forward. The gun is ready to be fired. This calls for a trigger. The forward end of the trigger fits into the sear. The forward end has two small cams, here and here. This is the cam surface of one of them. These cams correspond with cams on the inside of the base of the sear. Here is one of them, and here is the other. Let us watch the forward movement again, and this time from the side and inside the breech block. The top of the cocking lever is progressively turned to the rear. Remember, its lower end fits in the firing pin, which is held by the sear bent. Any defect in the sear, spring, or firing pin might allow the firing pin to fly forward prematurely, but the round cannot be struck at this point because the firing pin is held by the lower end of the cocking lever. The movement of the cocking lever itself is controlled by the recess in the top plate. Thus, the round could not be fired until the breech block was forward and the breech locked. However, if we continue movement under normal conditions, we find that the sear is drawn along the trigger until the cams become engaged. Only now can the gun be fired, by lifting the tail of the trigger, which draws the sear down and frees the firing pin. Let us examine how this automatic firing takes place. First, the round within the chamber. Notice the round does not fit the chamber tightly, but on being struck by the firing pin, a high pressure of gas is released, which is felt in all directions and expands the case to a tight fit. This seals the chamber and prevents the gases which force the round along the barrel from leaking into the gun body. This pressure is felt equally on the face of the breech block, causing recoil. Stopping the recoil here shows us that the breech block, barrel and barrel extension are locked together and recoil as one piece. Recoil is assisted by a device at the front of the barrel casing. The end of the barrel and the cone form a small chamber. Let's watch the path of the bullet through the cone. But stop. While the bullet's here, it partially seals the cone. The pressure of gases builds up behind the bullet. Therefore, the cone is under pressure. The only part free to move is the barrel, which slides in the casing, thus assisting recoil. When the bullet leaves the cone, gas pressure subsides in the barrel. The barrel and barrel extension and the breech block recoil about ½ an inch while still locked together, giving the bullet time to leave the barrel. Only then can the breech be unlocked, so that the breech block can continue its recoil independently, assisted by a sharp flick from the accelerator claws as they rotate to lock the barrel extension and lock frame together. Now let us put the breech block forward again to see another simultaneous action of recoil. In the chamber is an empty case which has to be replaced with a live round. The empty case is held on the face of the breech block in the extractor grooves. At the same time, a live round is gripped by the transporter. Recoil of the breech block withdraws both of them. When the empty case is cleared of the chamber, it drops off. You will remember that during backward movement, cocking takes place and the return spring becomes compressed. It immediately asserts itself to drive the block forward. The sear rides along to the trigger cams, which are held down by keeping the trigger pressed. Stopping the action here to look inside, we shall see the breech block become locked to the barrel extension. Only now can the sear go sufficiently far forward to pull itself down on the trigger cams, thus firing the round. Automatic firing continues as long as the trigger is pressed or the ammunition lasts. Knowledge of the operation of the gun gives the gunner confidence and helps him to make effective this heavy volume of fire.